Hello and welcome to this first lesson on our topic of interdependence. Today we're going to be looking at food chains and food webs. By the end of the lesson you should be able to state the definition of a food chain and a food web. You should be able to describe what a food chain and a food web show, and you should be able to evaluate why a food web shows more accurately the feeding relationships of living organisms than a food chain. So as always, before we move over onto our whiteboard, I would like you to write the title in your books, please. Food chains and food webs. This is the start of an interdependence topic, so this is the start of a new topic. This is the first lesson in that topic, and let's make a start. So, in order to survive, you need energy from food in your cells, okay? So, all living things need food for their cells to survive. So, we can write in red, first of all, because it's an important thing, that all cells need energy to survive. Now, we can show where cells get their energy from in order to survive using a food chain. So our first keyword is the term, or term is the key term, food chain. Okay, and a food chain can be defined as a diagram that shows feeding relationships I'm sorry that the S has gone off there, that should say relationships. A diagram that shows feeding relationships between organisms and we can put a dash, i.e. what an organism eats. So dash what an organism eats. Now, it essentially shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another. So we can add underneath here, we can say that it shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another. Now, if we were to look at a food chain, it would look something like this, and I'm going to take one of the images off the lesson slides so that you can see what a food chain looks like. Okay, now this is showing that we've got an acacia tree which is collecting the sun's energy in a process known as photosynthesis and trapping energy in its cells. The impala is eating the acacia tree and getting energy from the tree. The cheetah is eating the impala, which is then getting energy from it, and the lion is then eating the cheetah, which is getting the energy passed on to it. So we can say that food chains have the following features. So food chains have the following features. Dot dot. We can say that the first organism is a producer. So the first organism is a producer. And we can define a producer as the following. We can define it as an organism that traps the sun's energy in photosynthesis. So an organism that traps the sun's energy using photosynthesis. So the first organism in all food chains is a producer. And if we look at our diagram we've got here, the first organism is an acacia tree, so this is our producer. Okay, the acacia tree is our producer. So we can say, and I'm just going to put it in red to make it clear, all food chains start with a producer, with worst H ever, with a producer. Okay. The second organism is always a herbivore or an omnivore. Okay. So we can say that the second organism, we used white, didn't we? The second organism that eats the producer is a herbivore. Sometimes it can be an omnivore. However, for now, we're going to assume that it's a herbivore. Just have a swig of my drink. In fact, no, we're going to add to this. The second organism that eats the producer is a herbivore or an omnivore. Okay, and that gives us two more keywords we can write down. A herbivore is an animal that only eats plants. So a herbivore is an animal that only eats plants. And a omnivore, which I'm going to have to put up here because we haven't got much room, an omnivore is an animal that eats both plants and other animals. So an animal that eats both plants and other animals. Both plants and other animals. Okay, that should say animals. I do apologise that I've gone off the screen. So if the producer in our food chain is the acacia tree, our secondary organism, our second organism is our impala. So this is our second organism. Second organism. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm not sure if this is correct, but an impala is a herbivore. It only eats plants. So impalas will eat the producer. Our next step is that the third organism is a carnivore. So we can say that the third organism in a food chain is a carnivore. Now, a carnivore is an organism that only eats meat. Okay? So a carnivore is an organism that only eats meat. Okay? So our third organism in the food chain we've got up here would be the cheetah. So this would be our third organism. Sometimes there are 4 organisms in a food chain. It's very rare that it goes past 4. But our 4th organism in this one is the lion. And the lion only eats meat, so it is also a carnivore. Now, arrows show the transfer of energy from one organism to another. So the energy that is trapped from the sun by the producer, the acacia tree, is passed on to the impala. So we draw an arrow going from the tree to the impala. The energy that's in the impala is passed on to the cheetah when the cheetah eats the impala. So we draw an arrow that way. So the final thing I'm going to write on this slide is that arrows, and I've got it in red because it's important, arrows show the transfer of energy stored in food from one organism to the next. From one organism to the next. So what we've said on this slide so far is that all cells need energy to survive. A food chain is a diagram that shows feeding relationships between organisms, i.e. what the organism eats. It shows how energy is transferred from one organism to another. We've put up an example of a food chain here. We've got an acacia tree trapping the sun from the energy from the sun. It is a producer. It's an organism that traps the sun's energy using photosynthesis. All food chains start with a producer. The secondary organism, in our case, is the impala, and the impala is a herbivore. It only eats plants. However, sometimes it can be an omnivore, an animal that eats both plants and other animals. And then the third and fourth organisms are carnivores. They eat the other animals before them. So even if we just clear our screen, we don't want to save it. We want to turn it back to black, and I want to add in the image that we just had, just to quickly go over something. So we want our food chain again. and I'm going to put it in the middle up here for the time being. So in this food chain, we've got the acacia tree, which is our producer, which we've just said. So the acacia tree is the producer. We've got our second organism, we've got our third organism, and we've got our fourth organism. In this example, the impala is a prey organism. So our impala can be said to be prey. P-R-E-Y. A prey organism is an organism that is hunted, and eaten by another organism. Now, can you see on the board on the food chain another prey animal? Have a think, pause the video if you need to. There is another prey animal in this food chain. So if you said to yourself, or if you thought that the cheetah was also a prey animal, you were correct, because the cheetah is eaten by the lion. But in this food chain, the lion is not eaten by anything. It is the one that does the eating. So the lion can be defined as what we call a predator. A predator. Now a predator, P-R-E-D-A-T-O-R, a predator is an organism that hunts and eats other organisms. Okay? So in this diagram, the lion is a predator. However, there is another predator. The cheetah is not only a prey for the lion, but it's a predator of the impala. Okay? So predators and prey are important key terms when we think about food chains. Now, most food chains have only 4 or 5 different organisms. So we can say most food chains have a maximum of 4 or 5 organisms. Okay? Now, the reason they only have 4 or 5 is because each time an organism is eaten, some energy is lost. So we can say that this is because, and remember I'm putting all this in red because it's important, we can say that this is because when an organism is eaten, comma, some of the energy stored in its cells is lost. Okay. Now, let's pull up another image of our food chain. Let's use the same food chain again, okay, to explain this. So, before we talk about anything to do with this food chain, we do need to think about energy, okay? Energy is measured in joules, and we use kilojoules as the unit of energy, okay? So we can say that energy in food chains is measured in kilojoules. Which is capital K, capital J. Okay? When energy is passed on, only 10% of it is passed on each time. So I'll explain that a bit further in a moment, but for now we can say from one organism to another, comma, only 10% of the energy is passed on to the next organism. And I know this may seem like I'm speaking Japanese to you at the moment, but hopefully we're going to clear all this up. When we say 10%, that means that we only get 10 out of every 100. So let's assume in our food chain that the first organism, our producer, our acacia tree, is going to get 1,000 kilojoules of energy. So our acacia tree, and I'll pick a colour where we can actually see it, is getting 1,000 kilojoules. Okay? Now, when the impala eats the acacia tree, it's only getting 10% of that energy. So 10% of the energy from the acacia tree is passed to the impala. That would mean that the impala would only get 100 kilojoules of energy. So even though the acacia tree has 1,000 kilojoules, the impala would only get 100. When the cheetah eats the impala, 10% is passed on to the cheetah. But it's not 10% of 1,000, it's now 10% of 100. So the cheetah would only get 10 kilojoules of energy. The energy is then passed on from the cheetah to the lion, who would only get 10% again. When this lion picks up 10%, it is only going to get 1 kilojoule of energy. Therefore, it wouldn't be worth another organism hunting the lion to get more energy. Okay? So food chains are usually 4 or 5 organisms long. So we've said that a prey is an organism that is hunted and eaten by other organisms. A predator is an organism that hunts and eats other organisms. We've said that most food chains have a maximum of 4 or 5 organisms. This is because when one organism is eaten, some of the energy stored in its cells is lost. So only 90% of the energy is used by the acacia tree, so the impala only gets 100 kilojoules. 90% of that is used by the impala, so the cheetah only gets 10 kilojoules when it eats the impala. The cheetah then uses 90% of these 10 kilojoules to leave the lion with 1 kilojoule when he hunts or she hunts the cheetah. What this means is as you move up a food chain, the organism at the top usually has to eat a lot more than the ones lower down because they're getting less energy every time. If you didn't understand that, don't worry too much. It's not the end of the world, but I do want you to know what a predator and a prey is. So let's move on to our final part of this lesson. You'll be happy to know, I can hear you all cheering through the screen, that this lesson's nearly over. Now, if we've got a food chain, so we've got our food chains that we've just spoken about. So a food, that's the worst F ever. Food chains. If we've got a food chain and we rely on this to show us what an organism eats, such as in Africa where these animals would be found, this would imply that acacia trees are only eaten by impalas. Impalas only eat acacia trees. Cheetahs only eat impalas and lions only eat cheetahs. But most animals eat more than one type of food. So we can say, and again, I'm going to pick my favourite colour for today, red, because it's important. Most animals eat more than one type of food. Okay? So most animals eat more than one type of food. For this reason, we can use what's known as a food web. Okay? And we can define a food web as such. So a food web is defined as a diagram showing lots of food chains and how they are linked. Okay? Now, food webs show the multiple food sources of an organism. So a food web shows the multiple food sources of an organism. Now, I have prepared a diagram of a food web, which includes our food chain that we've been using in this lesson. So a food web would look something like this, and I need to make it a bit smaller so that it will fit. Would look something like this. It shows that not only does an impala eat acacia trees, but it also eats grass. So impalas eat both acacia trees and grass. But at the same time, impalas are not only eaten by cheetahs, they're also eaten by leopards. And at the same time, lions don't just eat cheetahs, they eat cheetahs, leopards, zebras and giraffes. You could get various food chains shown in this food web. You could go acacia tree, giraffe, lion. You could go acacia tree, impala, cheetah, lion, which we've got at the top. You could go acacia tree, impala, leopard, lion. You could go grass, zebra, lion. These are all lots of different food chains shown in this food web. So the final thing we can say is food chains in this food web, ... And we can show that we've got acacia tree, being eaten by a giraffe, which is then eaten by a lion. We've got the one above, so the acacia tree, going to the giraffe, going to the lion. We've got the one that's shown above. I'm not going to write that one out again because it seems a bit of a waste of time. We've got the acacia tree being eaten by an impala, being eaten by a leopard, and then being eaten by the lion. So we've got acacia tree, which is then eaten by the impala, which is then eaten by the leopard, which is then eaten by the lion. We've got the grass being eaten by the impala, which is then being eaten by the leopard, being eaten by the lion. We've got the grass being eaten by the impala, the cheetah and the lion. And we've got the grass being eaten by the zebra, which is then eaten by the lion. That's the final one I will write down. So we've got grass being eaten by the zebra, which is then eaten by the lion. So the difference is that with a food web, we can see all the different food sources of an organism, all the food chains put together. With a food chain, we're only seeing one food source of an organism. So, you should now be able to tell me the definition of a food chain and a food web. You should be able to describe what a food chain and a food web show, and you should be able to evaluate why food webs show more accurately the feeding relationship of living organisms than a food chain. I hope you have found this video useful. If you are stuck, please do not hesitate to send me an email or contact me through Google Classrooms, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Okay? Until next lesson, take care.